Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a world where monsters weren't just creatures from bedtime stories, they were an integral part of the medieval landscape. Picture this. You're a traveller in the 12th century, heading off into unknown lands. You pull out your map, hoping to find a route to safety or a distant city, but the map isn't what you expect. Instead of clean, defined borders and neat lines marking rivers and mountains. The map is filled with strange symbols and ominous warnings. Here be dragons, it says. Beware the sea serpent, it whispers. Welcome to medieval cartography, where the lines between myth, reality, and fear blurred, creating a world where monsters live just beyond the horizon. Maps in medieval times weren't exactly like the ones we use today. They didn't have Google Maps guiding you from point A to point B instead. They were often handcrafted and designed more for the purpose of storytelling and warnings than navigation. Sure, the land masses were mostly correct, but as soon as you got past the familiar world, things got weird. Monsters were often depicted as part of the landscape, lurking in the uncharted territories. Those maps weren't made for navigation, they were made for survival. And what better way to deter travellers from venturing too far into unknown lands than by showing them a huge, menacing sea serpent waiting to pull them under the waves. The inclusion of these mythical creatures was more than just artistic flair. These beasts represented the deep, often terrifying unknowns that lay beyond the horizons of the medieval mind. A map with a dragon or a manticore was more than just a work of art. It was a warning. If you were the type of person who dared to sail into the uncharted waters of the Mediterranean or walk through the untamed forests of northern Europe, the likelihood of encountering one of these beasts was far more real than you'd think. After all, if the map said a giant, scaly serpent was swimming in the ocean, then surely it was true, because who was going to argue with a map drawn by a monk? In the medieval world, maps were one of the few ways of visualising the world beyond one's immediate surroundings, without the luxury of modern science. People relied heavily on storytelling and hearsay to make sense of the unknown. If someone claimed to have seen a giant beast with a lion's body and a human face, then it must have been true after all. The world was full of wonders and mysteries, and who better to capture these than the monks and scribes who painstakingly crafted the illuminated manuscripts of the time they were tasked with recording and preserving knowledge. And they did so with an artful and often exaggerated hand. It's hard for us to imagine living in a time when the unknown was so profoundly mysterious and frightening. Today, we look at those old maps with a sense of amusement after all. The creatures depicted in them are things of fantasy, but to medieval people, these monsters were very real, and the world was full of perilous, unexplored lands where strange creatures roamed. No one was safe, and the stories of travellers and explorers were the only proof of what might await those daring enough to venture out. But let's step back for a moment. How did these creatures get onto these maps in the first place? The answer lies in something called bestiaries, medieval encyclopedias of beasts, where these creatures were lovingly catalogued for all to see. But these weren't just books about normal animals, oh no. Bestiaries were filled with illustrations of fantastical, sometimes nightmarish creatures that lived in the far corners of the world. And while some of these animals were based on real creatures, like elephants and crocodiles, many were imagined beasts that lurked in the shadows of folklore and myth. These beasts weren't just meant to horrify, they were also supposed to educate. They symbolised moral lessons, warning readers about sin or the dangers of the unknown. In fact, These bestiaries became such an important part of medieval life that they influenced not just people's understanding of the natural world, but also their art, culture, and religion. For instance, the unicorn, which we'll discuss later, was a symbol of purity and divinity. But for now, let's focus on the darker side of these beasts. Some of these monsters were terrifying in ways that we can barely comprehend today, like the man-eating griffin or the dragon that could burn entire villages to the ground with a single breath. These creatures weren't just figments of some bored scribe's imagination, they were warnings. Cautionary tales meant to keep you from wandering too far into uncharted territory. As we explore these maps and creatures, it's essential to understand that medieval people didn't have the luxury of knowing what was out there, unlike today, where we can jump on a plane and travel to the ends of the earth with a few clicks. The medieval world was full of uncertainties. People didn't know what lay beyond their village, their city, or their kingdom. What they did know was that if you travelled far enough, you might encounter something that could kill you, or worse, something you couldn't even comprehend. And if you were a sailor, well, the sea was both a source of life and a place of terrifying danger. Sea monsters were a common feature in medieval lore, and these creatures weren't just mythical, they were essential to understanding the sea's perils. Now, imagine being a sailor in the Mediterranean, navigating through waters where there were no landmarks, no GPS, and only the stars to guide you. The sea could seem endless, and every wave might hide a monster waiting to drag you under. If a map depicted a serpent-like creature coiled in the depths of the ocean, it wasn't just a warning, it was a story. It was meant to remind you that the sea, while vital for trade and travel, could also be a ruthless, unforgiving force. So, why do we still talk about these creatures today? Well, as strange as it may seem, these medieval monsters still live on in our imaginations. They have been immortalised in modern films, books, and even games. But beyond entertainment, these monsters tell us something crucial about the medieval worldview. They show us a time when mystery and fear ruled, and the unknown was more than just something to be feared, it was something to be respected. These creatures were more than just legends. They were part of a culture that didn't just tell stories for fun, but used them to understand and navigate a world that seemed both beautiful and terrifying. As we move through tonight's journey into the medieval world of monsters and maps, keep in mind that while these creatures may seem like fairy tales, they were part of a living, breathing culture. They were the product of a time when the world was a much more dangerous, much more uncertain place. And who knows, if you had lived in the 12th century, you might just have thought twice before setting sail or crossing into that dark forest. But now, let's take a deeper dive into some of these amazing, terrifying creatures. Grab your medieval map and let's get started on the adventure of a lifetime if you survive. That is, up next, we'll explore the bestiaries and discover just how far people's imaginations could stretch. Imagine walking into a dimly lit, stone-walled room, the scent of parchment and ink filling the air. On a wooden table before you lies a massive tome, its thick pages illuminated by the flickering candlelight. This isn't just any book. This is a bestiary, a medieval encyclopedia of beasts that, in its time, was as close as people could get to understanding the strange, terrifying creatures that populated the farthest corners of their world. If you were a monk in the 12th century, you may have spent countless hours in a scriptorium, carefully transcribing these works and decorating them with vibrant illustrations that would haunt the nightmares of future generations. Bestiaries were books that catalogued both real and mythical creatures, blending fact and fantasy into a single, awe-inspiring work of art. But these books weren't mere curiosities, they were essential tools for understanding the medieval view of the world, and more importantly, the world beyond their own. The beasts in these books weren't just randomly chosen. They were drawn from religious symbolism, ancient mythologies, and the incredibly limited and often wildly inaccurate knowledge of the time. So, when medieval artists and scribes painstakingly created these bestiaries, they weren't just trying to entertain, they were reflecting their beliefs, fears, and curiosities about the unknown. The creatures in bestiaries were not only depicted with vivid detail, but were often imbued with deep, symbolic meanings. For example, the unicorn wasn't just a pretty, horned horse that could gallop through magical forests. It was a symbol of purity, grace, and the divine. The unicorn's horn was said to have the power to purify poisoned water, and it was believed to be so pure that only a virgin could tame it. This idea of purity and sanctity was crucial in medieval Christianity, and as a result, unicorns were often featured alongside Christian symbols, such as the Virgin Mary. Of course, unicorns didn't exist in real life, but they captured the imagination of those who read the bestiaries, who couldn't help but believe in their mythic purity. Then there were the creatures like the griffin, a hybrid animal that was half lion, half eagle. The griffin symbolized strength, power, and majesty. It was said to live in the mountains of Scythia, guarding treasure with its sharp beak and talons. The griffin was often associated with kings and emperors, representing the qualities they wished to embody: strength in battle and wisdom in ruling. But what's interesting is that, while the griffin was a dominant force in the bestiaries, it was also feared. It wasn't just a noble guardian of treasure, it was a force of nature that could rip you apart if you dared to challenge it. The combination of the king of the beasts and the king of the skies made the griffin an imposing creature, one that was both revered and feared. But not all creatures in bestiaries were so dignified. Take the manticore, for example. This monstrous beast had the body of a lion, the face of a man, and a tail that was capable of firing poisonous spines at its prey. The manticore, much like the griffin, was a hybrid, but unlike the griffin, it was not a creature of nobility. The manticore was a nightmare, a creature to be avoided at all costs. Its terrifying appearance and deadly abilities made it a symbol of evil in medieval thought, in the world of bestiaries. It wasn't just about being scared of what lurked beyond the horizon, it was also about confronting the darker side of human nature. The manticore embodied the dangers of human vices, especially wrath and greed, as its appearance was a twisted reflection of human desires. There was also the basilisk, a creature that could kill with a single glance. The basilisk was said to be born from a serpent's egg, hatched by a rooster, and its eyes were so poisonous that anyone who looked into them would immediately perish. It was believed to lurk in dark caves and shadowy places, waiting to ambush its next victim. In the medieval imagination, the basilisk symbolized the destructive power of envy and jealousy, like many other creatures in the bestiary. The basilisk's myth was more than just a story about a deadly animal. It was a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked emotions. And let's not forget about the sea creatures, like the sea serpent, which frequently appeared in medieval bestiaries. The sea serpent was a symbol of the unknown dangers that awaited sailors in the vast, uncharted waters. Its long, sinuous body was often depicted coiling around ships, dragging them into the abyss, while the sea serpent was an actual animal known to us as an eel or giant squid. Its mythic form took on a more monstrous quality in the minds of the medieval people who feared the deep oceans. For them, the sea was just as much a source of life as it was a place of peril, and the creatures that lived beneath the waves were symbols of both wonder and dread. While the majority of these creatures were purely mythical, they were often drawn from real animals. The lion's body, the eagle's wings, and the serpent's venomous powers were all taken from creatures that were known to exist. However, these real animals were transformed in the minds of medieval people, twisted into something far more dangerous, and in the world of bestiaries, they were not merely catalogued as beasts of terror, they were also tied to the lessons and teachings of the church. Bestiaries were not just books for leisure reading, they were often used as tools for spiritual instruction. Each animal was seen as a metaphor for a particular vice or virtue, and the monks who wrote them often included moral lessons in the descriptions of the creatures. For instance, the lion was a symbol of Christ, who was both powerful and merciful. The unicorn, with its purity, represented the Virgin Mary. The serpent, meanwhile, was a symbol of sin and temptation, lurking in the shadows, ready to strike. The bestiary wasn't just a compilation of monsters, though. It was also a way for medieval people to come to terms with the strange and often terrifying world they inhabited. It was their way of making sense of the chaos, to impose some order on the vastness of the unknown. After all, if you could name a creature, you could understand it, tame it, and ultimately protect yourself from it. The same goes for the sea. If you could depict the sea serpent, you could better understand the dangers of the ocean and prepare for them. What makes bestiaries so fascinating is that they were as much a product of their time as they were a reflection of the human experience. They were not written with the modern mind in mind. They were written by people who, despite their faith in God, lived in a world full of fears and uncertainties. They may have had access to the Bible, but they also had stories of dragons, unicorns, and manticores, creatures that were part of their cultural fabric, intertwined with their understanding of the world. In fact, the bestiary was a dynamic piece of medieval thought, constantly evolving as new creatures and stories were discovered, added, and interpreted. As the age of exploration unfolded and new lands were discovered, bestiaries expanded, incorporating new beasts that explorers encountered, blending real-world discoveries with the mythic and the supernatural. These creatures weren't just fictional, they were born out of the real-world dangers and challenges of medieval life. They were, in essence, a mix of history and imagination, a way for medieval minds to grapple with the unknown. In this sense, the bestiary was far more than just a catalogue of monsters. It was a window into the medieval soul. It was a reflection of their hopes, their fears, and their understanding of the divine and the monstrous alike. It was their way of capturing the world, both the familiar and the mysterious, and of making sense of a reality that was anything but predictable. So, the next time you come across an illuminated page of a medieval bestiary, don't just think of it as a book of strange creatures, think of it as a key to understanding the medieval mind. It's not just about what people believed about the world, it's about how they navigated it. Now, speaking of navigating unknown waters, let's take a closer look at the creatures of legend that appeared most often on those old maps, from the mythic unicorns to the ferocious dragons. Our next chapter will delve into the iconic beasts that captivated medieval imagination. Picture this: you're walking through a lush, sun-dappled forest, the air thick with the scent of moss and wildflowers. As you follow the winding path, a soft rustle catches your attention. You stop, your breath held in awe, as through the trees emerges a magnificent creature, a pure white horse, its spiraled horn gleaming in the sunlight. But this isn't just any horse, it's a unicorn, the stuff of legend, a creature so pure that, even in the medieval mind, it was regarded as a living symbol of divinity and grace. But before you get too carried away with the enchanting image of a peaceful unicorn frolicking in the woods, let's take a moment to dig into what this creature actually represented during the Middle Ages, and how it wasn't always quite as charming as those dreamy illustrations suggest. You see, unicorns weren't merely fairy tale creatures, they were steeped in rich religious symbolism. And in many ways they were symbols of purity, sanctity, and sometimes the divine itself. In medieval Europe, unicorns were the subjects of myths and stories that blended elements of truth, religion, and fantasy. For many, they were seen as real creatures, beautiful, elusive, and untamable. But beyond their captivating, almost ethereal appearance, unicorns were also highly symbolic. They were frequently associated with the Virgin Mary, as they were thought to represent purity and chastity, qualities that were also central to her character in Christian teachings. The unicorn, with its white coat and singular horn, was seen as a perfect being, a representation of divine grace. The fact that the unicorn could only be tamed by a virgin was an essential part of its symbolic relationship with the Virgin Mary. Unicorns were often depicted in medieval Christian art, most famously in the Hunt of the Unicorn tapestries, which showed a group of noblemen hunting the beast. But interestingly enough, these tapestries weren't just about capturing a mythical animal, they were a visual representation of spiritual purity and sacrifice. The hunt for the unicorn symbolised the pursuit of the soul's purification, and the noble knights chasing it reflected the journey of the Christian soul toward God in these depictions. The unicorn's eventual capture by the Virgin represented the soul's redemption and union with the divine. So, you could say that unicorns weren't just legendary beasts, they were almost like visual sermons, encouraging believers to live pure and righteous lives, but despite their elevated status in religious symbolism. Unicorns also appeared in other, more secular settings. Medieval literature often painted the unicorn as a wild and unpredictable creature, difficult to capture and tame, symbolising the untamed forces of nature. The idea that the unicorn was so rare and elusive only added to its mystique. Some accounts even placed unicorns in far-flung, exotic lands like the mountains of India, and described them as being dangerous and deadly, more of a challenge to hunt than a symbol of peace. What's fascinating, though, is that unicorns weren't solely the product of medieval European imagination. The origins of the unicorn myth can be traced back much further, with mentions of a single-horned creature in ancient texts from Greece and India. The Greeks referred to the unicorn as the monokeros, a horse-like creature with a horn protruding from its forehead. The idea of the unicorn spread through many ancient cultures, including in Mesopotamia and Persia, where it was considered a creature of power and mystery. But it wasn't until the Middle Ages that the unicorn became firmly entrenched in European thought, where it was both a religious symbol and a creature of legend. Despite their ancient origins, medieval interpretations of unicorns were often quite fantastical. Many medieval scholars and writers claimed that unicorns lived in far-off lands and were difficult to capture because they were so elusive. Some even believed that their horns had magical powers, able to purify water and heal sickness. These stories were so deeply ingrained in medieval society that they influenced everything from medicine to art. One of the more enduring legends involved the unicorn's horn, which was believed to be an antidote to poison. In fact, powdered unicorn horn was highly prized in medieval Europe and fetched a fortune. Kings, queens, and wealthy nobles sought out unicorn horns to protect themselves from poison, believing them to be a powerful antidote. Of course, the reality was a little less magical. Unicorn horns were often, in fact, narwhal tusks long, spiral-shaped ivory tusks that were found in the Arctic seas. These tusks, brought back from expeditions to the north, were sold at exorbitant prices and passed off as genuine unicorn horns. But for the medieval world, the myth was far more important than the reality. Unicorns were so deeply embedded in the medieval worldview that the idea of a magical, powerful creature was often enough to inspire awe. The unicorn symbolised both an ideal and an impossibility, an unattainable purity and perfection that, at least in the realm of fantasy, could exist in this world. Despite the unicorn's lofty spiritual connections, there were also some rather odd and humorous accounts of the creature. Some medieval writers believed that the unicorn could be found only in the most remote corners of the world. They described it as a solitary creature that roamed alone in dense forests or high mountain ranges. Others claimed that unicorns had the ability to communicate with humans, and they would often appear before virgins to engage in an otherworldly conversation. Can you imagine that? A lovely white horse with a spiraled horn, just casually chatting with a young maiden in the woods. While it might seem absurd to us today, these stories were taken very seriously at the time. One of the strangest aspects of unicorn lore was the belief that unicorns had a particular affinity for virgins. In some accounts, the unicorn would only approach a virgin, and once it was near her, it would lie down and allow itself to be captured. This idea came from the belief that the unicorn's pure nature made it vulnerable to the touch of a virgin, making it a fitting companion for those who lived chaste, holy lives. It was said that only a woman untouched by sin could tame the wildest of creatures. This idea, while seemingly quaint today, was a reflection of the medieval obsession with purity and chastity. Historians still argue about the origins of the unicorn myth. Some scholars suggest that the legend of the unicorn is based on real animals, such as the Indian rhinoceros or the oryx, which were mistakenly identified as unicorns by travellers returning from distant lands. Others argue that the myth developed independently from these real-world creatures, originating purely from the human imagination and shaped by religious symbolism. The truth, as usual, is likely a blend of both a mixture of cultural exchanges, natural wonders, and the human desire to explain the unknown through fantastical creatures. So, what does the story of the unicorn tell us about the medieval mindset? For one, it reveals a deep yearning for purity, for an unattainable ideal of innocence and grace that was symbolised by this elusive creature. The unicorn was the perfect paradox, both a symbol of divine perfection and an object of desire, impossible to capture and yet always within reach. It reflected the medieval soul struggle to reconcile the spiritual with the worldly. But it also reflected something else, the human fascination with the unknown and the unknowable. The unicorn wasn't just a creature of fantasy, it was a way for people to process their own aspirations, their own flaws, and their own beliefs about purity and sanctity. As we move away from unicorns, let's step into another realm of medieval monsters, the griffins. These creatures were no less captivating or mysterious than unicorns, but they represented a very different aspect of the medieval imagination. While unicorns were pure and divine, griffins were powerful, regal, and fierce beasts that commanded both fear and admiration. We'll take a look at their fascinating dual nature next, where they'll soar above the earth, blending the king of the beasts with the king of the skies. Imagine walking through a dense forest, with only the faint rustle of leaves accompanying your every step. Suddenly, you hear a sound that stops you dead in your tracks, a powerful screech that reverberates through the trees, followed by the roar of something far more familiar. As you turn toward the source of the sound, you see it a creature that towers above you, its wings spread wide, and its golden eyes staring you down. It's not a bird, it's not a lion. It's something far more majestic, something that couldn't possibly exist yet. There it stands before you, the griffin. In the world of medieval monsters, the griffin was the quintessential hybrid, combining the nobility and power of the lion with the grace and agility of the eagle. While the unicorn may have been a symbol of purity and divine beauty, the griffin was a symbol of power, strength, and nobility. Its presence in medieval lore is as fierce as it is fascinating, with legends depicting griffins as protectors of treasure, guardians of the heavens, and sometimes even the powerful stewards of royal domains. The griffin represented the union of two of the most dominant creatures in the natural world, the lion, the king of beasts, and the eagle, the king of the skies, together. These traits gave the griffin a presence that was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. But let's not get too carried away with the imagery just yet before we dive into the world of griffins. Let's take a moment to look at their history and symbolism in medieval society. The griffin's origins stretch back to ancient cultures, where it was revered as a symbol of strength and courage. In fact, the griffin appears in many ancient mythologies, including those of Egypt, Persia, and Greece. Ancient Egyptian tombs were decorated with griffins to represent the god's protection, while in Persia, they were depicted as guardians of royal treasures. In Greek mythology, griffins were seen as the noble guardians of the divine, and were often portrayed as protecting the chariots of the gods. These ancient interpretations of the griffin set the tone for its medieval persona. In medieval Europe, the griffin came to symbolize royal authority and divine protection. Its powerful, protective nature made it the perfect heraldic creature for kings and emperors, and it was often featured on coats of arms and crests. The griffin's combination of the eagle and the lion made it a fitting emblem for rulers, as it represented the ability to conquer both land and sky. Kings who wanted to assert their dominance over both the physical and spiritual realms found the griffin to be an ideal symbol. The lion's strength represented the ruler's power over the land, while the eagle's wings symbolized the ruler's sovereignty over the heavens. But the griffin wasn't just reserved for royalty and divine representation. It also appeared in the more practical realm of medieval bestiaries. Those illuminated volumes filled with descriptions of fantastical creatures, bestiaries, while containing a great deal of religious symbolism, were also a source of entertainment and education. They described the nature of various creatures, from the real to the imaginary, and offered allegorical interpretations of their behaviour. The griffin, with its noble appearance and fierce nature, was often used as a symbol of courage and strength, encouraging knights and warriors to embody the same qualities. In medieval literature, griffins were depicted as both protectors and conquerors. They were often associated with treasure and guardianship, serving as the protectors of sacred or precious objects. In many stories, the griffin was said to guard vast riches hidden in remote, untamed lands. These treasures were often linked to divine or royal power, and the griffin's role as a guardian symbolized the strength needed to protect these treasures from greedy invaders. The griffin's ability to fly also added to its air of invincibility, making it a formidable creature capable of defending its treasure from both land and sky. Despite their regal and protective nature, griffins were not always the benevolent creatures they seem to be in some legends. They were portrayed as fierce, merciless creatures that would attack without warning. The griffin's fearsome reputation in medieval tales made it a symbol of the dangers of unchecked power, but also of the need to defend one's realm and treasures from those who would seek to steal them. In these stories, the griffin was the ultimate protector, a creature whose power and strength could not be easily overcome. The griffin's status as a legendary creature wasn't confined to just medieval Europe. It spread across the known world, appearing in cultures ranging from the Middle East to Asia. In some cultures, the griffin was seen as a divine messenger, delivering messages from the gods. In others, it was revered as a symbol of wisdom, as the griffin was believed to possess an almost supernatural knowledge of the world. This knowledge, combined with its strength and power, made the griffin a creature that demanded respect from all who encountered it. While the griffin may have been a creature of immense power and significance, its existence was not limited to the pages of bestiaries and legends. The griffin was also depicted in medieval art, where it appeared in everything from tapestries to stained glass windows. These artistic representations of the griffin often depicted it in the midst of battle. Wings spread wide, with its sharp claws and talons, ready to strike. The griffin was often shown as a heroic figure, a creature whose very presence commanded respect and awe. These depictions added to the mystique of the griffin, further cementing its place as one of the most iconic creatures of medieval mythology. Despite its widespread presence in medieval culture, the griffin's true nature was not always clear. Historians still argue about whether the griffin was meant to symbolize a specific creature or if it was an entirely imaginative creation. Some scholars suggest that the griffin was inspired by the discovery of prehistoric fossils, such as the remains of large carnivorous birds or the bones of ancient creatures that resembled lions. Others believe that the griffin was simply a creation of medieval storytellers, a fantastical combination of two of the most powerful animals in the natural world. Whatever its origins, the griffin's influence on medieval culture is undeniable, and its image has continued to captivate the human imagination to this day. As we leave the land of griffins behind, we must venture deeper into the realm of mythical beasts. Next, we'll encounter a creature that has the body of a lion, the tail of a scorpion, and a face that could haunt your nightmares, the manticore. This terrifying hybrid, like the griffin, is a perfect example of how medieval minds sought to combine elements of nature in ways that made sense only in the realm of legend. So brace yourself, because the manticore is one beast you won't soon forget. You're walking through a dark, fog-covered forest, your steps slow and deliberate, every footfall echoing through the dense trees. You've been lost for hours, the only sound being the rustle of the leaves underfoot. As the night grows darker, the air thickens with tension. Suddenly, you hear it, the sound of something moving behind you, the faint scraping of claws on stone, the rhythmic swish of a tail. You turn quickly, only to be met by a face, but it's not the face of a man or beast you recognize. It's the twisted, terrifying visage of a creature from your worst nightmares. It has the body of a lion, the tail of a scorpion, and the face of a man. This is the manticore, and it's come to claim you. The manticore is one of the most chilling creatures of medieval mythology, a nightmarish blend of human and animal traits designed to send a chill down the spine. It was a creature that seemed to straddle the line between reality and the supernatural, defying the boundaries of what was considered possible in the natural world. Described as having the body of a lion, a tail tipped with a deadly stinger, and the head of a man. The manticore was a beast that struck terror into the hearts of those who heard its name. Its very existence seemed to challenge the laws of nature, as it combined elements that were both familiar and utterly alien. The origins of the manticore are somewhat murky, but it's clear that this creature captured the medieval imagination in ways few others did. Some sources suggest that the manticore's appearance was inspired by ancient descriptions of a real animal, possibly the Indian lion, or a type of large predator that medieval travellers encountered during their journeys. Others believe the manticore was a purely mythical creature, the product of imaginative minds attempting to create a beast that embodied the ultimate fear, a creature with the power of the lion, the poison of the scorpion, and the intellect of a man. In the bestiaries, where creatures both real and imaginary were catalogued, the manticore's nature was painted as one of pure evil. It was said to hunt in the night, attacking anyone foolish enough to wander into its territory. The manticore's human face, which is often described as being both captivating and horrifying, made it an even more unsettling creature. Its human-like expression was enough to draw in its prey. Who might approach the creature out of curiosity or a strange sense of empathy, only to meet a swift, deadly end? The manticore's tail, equipped with a venomous sting, made it a master of ambush, able to strike with deadly precision. One of the most famous features of the manticore was its ability to shoot its deadly spikes. Some accounts say that the creature's tail would shoot poisoned quills at its prey, hitting with the force of a crossbow bolt. These sharp, venom-laden spikes were one of the manticore's most terrifying weapons, and they made it a creature that no one, even the bravest knights, would dare to face head-on. This lethal method of attack made the manticore not just a powerful monster, but one that could bring down even the mightiest warriors with ease. In medieval tales, the manticore was often portrayed as a guardian of the unknown, lurking in the dark corners of the earth, waiting for unsuspecting travellers to wander too far. It was a creature that embodied the dangers of venturing into the unknown, and its presence in folklore served as a warning to those who might be too curious or brave for their own good. The manticore's combination of human and animal traits made it a creature that was both relatable and utterly foreign. A perfect example of the medieval tendency to create hybrid creatures that blurred the lines between man, beast, and God. Historians still argue about the precise symbolism of the manticore. Some suggest that its grotesque, hybrid form represents the dangers of crossing boundaries, whether those boundaries are moral, spiritual, or physical. The manticore's human face, a key feature of its disturbing appearance, could be seen as a reflection of the dangers of human nature itself. The darker aspects of humanity that are capable of becoming monstrous when left unchecked. Others argue that the manticore was simply a product of medieval storytelling, a creature designed to inspire fear and awe without any deeper meaning. In medieval times, the manticore was more than just a creature of horror. It was a symbol of the unknown and the unknowable. It was a reminder that there were dangers in the world that could not be explained, that some things were beyond human understanding. The manticore's very existence seemed to be a challenge to reason and rationality. Its combination of animal and human traits defied natural law, and it existed as a reminder that the medieval world was full of mysteries that could never be fully explained. As the manticore's legend spread, it became a fixture in many works of medieval art. Artists depicted the creature in a variety of ways, from terrifying and grotesque to strangely regal. In some depictions, the manticore is shown sitting proudly on its haunches, its lion-like body and human face both fierce and regal. In others, it is shown in mid-strike, its tail raised high to deliver a fatal blow. These images of the manticore added to its mystique, making it one of the most iconic and terrifying creatures of medieval mythology. The manticore's influence didn't fade with the Middle Ages. In modern times, it has remained a fixture of popular culture, appearing in everything from fantasy literature to video games. Its fearsome appearance and lethal abilities have made it a popular choice for authors and creators who want to explore the darker side of human nature, as well as the eternal struggle between man and beast. The manticore, with its terrifying combination of lion, scorpion, and man, continues to captivate our imaginations, reminding us of the monsters that lurk just beyond the edge of our understanding. As we leave the manticore behind, we now turn our gaze to one of the most enduring and beloved creatures of medieval mythology, the dragon. Unlike the manticore, which embodied terror and danger, the dragon was both feared and revered in medieval cultures. It was a creature of ancient power, often seen as a symbol of both destruction and creation. So, prepare yourself for a tale of fire-breathing beasts, knights in shining armour, and the endless battle between good and evil. For the dragon story is one that has echoed through history for centuries. If you were living in the medieval world, there were only two kinds of dragons, the kind you feared and the kind you revered. Picture it, you're walking down a dirt path on a cool, foggy morning, the sun barely breaking through the horizon. Suddenly, you hear it a rumble, deep and powerful, like thunder rolling in from a distant storm. The ground shakes beneath you, the trees tremble, and there, rising from the mist, you see it. The creature's scales glisten in the dim light, fire flickering from its nostrils. The dragon, a creature of myth and legend, a force of nature that could scorch entire villages or protect them. Depending on whose story you are hearing, dragons have been a staple of human storytelling for thousands of years, and their presence in medieval folklore is nothing short of legendary. These creatures, often depicted as enormous, winged reptiles with the power to breathe fire, were the stuff of nightmares for some and symbols of power for others. The medieval world saw dragons not just as terrifying beasts to be slain, but as potent symbols, beings that represented the forces of nature, the unknown, and the unimaginable power of the world beyond human control. To medieval minds, the dragon was a mystery, a creature that straddled the line between divine and demonic, between good and evil. In many medieval cultures, dragons were seen as ancient, powerful creatures that had existed long before humans. They were often associated with the earth's primal forces: fire, water, and air, and in some cultures, dragons were believed to be the very embodiment of nature's raw power. These were not just animals, but almost godlike beings, capable of destruction and creation in equal measure. Depending on the dragon, it could either bring ruin or act as a guardian to the people, making them as much a symbol of strength as they were a source of terror. The legend of St. George and the dragon is one of the most famous and enduring dragon myths of the medieval period. According to the story, St. George, a Christian knight, defeated a fearsome dragon that had been terrorizing a village. In many versions of the tale, the dragon is depicted as a symbol of evil, representing the pagan forces that Christianity sought to overcome. George's victory over the dragon was seen as a triumph of good over evil, with the dragon symbolizing the dark forces that stood in opposition to God's will. But not all dragons in medieval folklore were viewed as evil. In fact, some dragons were considered to be wise and protective creatures in Norse mythology. The dragon Fafnir was originally a dwarf who transformed into a dragon due to his greed. While Fafnir was a terrifying creature, his story also emphasized the importance of wisdom and caution when dealing with greed. Similarly, in Chinese mythology, the dragon is often seen as a benevolent force, a symbol of strength, power, and good fortune. Chinese dragons are typically depicted as benevolent creatures, closely associated with water and the weather, controlling the rains that brought fertility to the land. This duality of the dragon, both a symbol of destruction and protection, was a major theme in medieval depictions of the creature. On one hand, the dragon's fire-breathing abilities and enormous size made it a formidable foe for any knight or adventurer brave enough to face it. But on the other hand, dragons were often associated with treasure, hidden in remote caves or hoarded in ancient castles. The quest to slay a dragon and claim its hoard became one of the most enduring tropes of medieval folklore. The idea of a knight setting off on a daring adventure to defeat a dragon and claim its treasure resonated deeply with the medieval imagination, reflecting both the allure of wealth and the danger of the unknown. The dragon's role in medieval stories was also often tied to the concept of a hero's journey. In many stories, a hero, often a knight or a king, would set off on a dangerous quest to kill a dragon, facing immense challenges along the way. The dragon represented the ultimate obstacle, one that required courage, strength, and cunning to overcome. But the dragon was not always simply a beast to be slain. Sometimes it was a creature that could be reasoned with or even befriended. In some stories, the hero's triumph over the dragon was not just about defeating the creature, but about understanding it and learning from it. This reflects the medieval worldview, where the struggle between man and monster was often seen as a reflection of the struggle between good and evil within the human soul. Dragons were also often tied to the concept of wealth, with their treasure hoards symbolizing the ultimate prize for any adventurer. These hoards were often depicted as vast collections of gold, jewels, and magical artifacts, everything a knight could dream of. The dragon guarding this treasure was not just a physical obstacle, but a representation of the difficulty and cost of attaining great wealth. The knight's victory over the dragon and his subsequent claim to the treasure was seen as a reward for his bravery and perseverance. This theme is echoed in many medieval tales, where the hero's reward for defeating the dragon is not just material wealth, but spiritual growth or moral enlightenment. While the idea of the dragon as a treasure hoarder and fierce adversary became the dominant image in later medieval tales, early depictions of dragons were often more ambiguous. In some of the earliest known accounts, dragons were seen as creatures that were to be respected rather than feared. The ancient Greeks, for example, told tales of dragons that guarded sacred sites or divine treasures. But these dragons were not always evil. In fact, some dragons were depicted as protectors, entrusted with guarding powerful relics or important locations. This concept of the dragon as a protector or guardian continued in medieval legends, especially in stories involving magical swords or enchanted items. In these tales, the dragon was often the final guardian of a powerful artifact, and the hero's quest was not just to defeat the dragon, but to prove his worthiness to wield the artifact. This aspect of the dragon, as a protector rather than a villain, was especially prevalent in Arthurian legends, where dragons were often depicted as guardians of ancient wisdom or magical powers. Over time, the image of the dragon as a fearsome beast that needed to be slain became more prominent in medieval stories, particularly in the context of Christian mythology. As Christianity spread across Europe, dragons began to take on a more sinister role, often representing the forces of chaos, sin, or paganism. The dragon's fire-breathing abilities and its destructive nature made it an ideal symbol for evil, and many Christian saints, including Saint George, were depicted as slaying dragons as part of their divine missions. Despite their fearsome reputation, dragons remained fascinating creatures throughout medieval times. Their ability to transcend the boundaries between the real and the fantastical made them symbols of the unknown, embodying the mysteries of the natural world and the forces that humans could neither control nor fully understand. Dragons represented both the primal fears of the medieval world and the possibility of transcending those fears, of confronting the unknown and emerging victorious. As the medieval period gave way to the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, the dragon's role in European culture began to shift. The medieval concept of the dragon as a powerful, mystical creature gradually gave way to the more rational, scientific worldview of the Enlightenment. However, the dragon's legacy as a symbol of both destruction and wisdom endured, influencing literature, art, and popular culture for centuries to come. In the modern era, dragons continue to capture our imaginations, from J.R.R. Tolkien's Smaug to the dragons of Game of Thrones. These creatures remain a powerful part of our cultural mythology, but the medieval dragon, both terrifying and awe-inspiring, remains the archetype that continues to shape how we view these legendary beasts. Now, with dragons fading into the realms of myth and legend, we turn our attention to a creature of a different nature, the centaur, a hybrid of human and horse. The centaur was another product of the medieval imagination, and it brings its own strange blend of wisdom, chaos, and mischief hold tight because the centaur's tale is one of laughter, confusion, and wild adventures that only the most daring of knights would survive. Alright, let's pause for a moment and picture something a bit unusual. You're trudging through the thick woods of medieval Europe, the air cool and a bit damp. Your armour creaks as you make your way along a winding path, and then, suddenly, you hear the sound of hooves, not the sound of a simple horse, mind you, but the rhythmic pounding of something much heavier. Your heart races as you try to make sense of the approaching sounds, only to look up and find a half-man, half-horse hybrid charging straight at you. That, my friend, is a centaur. And if you think it's just a monster of mythology, well, welcome to the medieval imagination, where beasts like these roamed freely in the land of the supernatural. A half-man, half-horse creature seems like something straight out of a fantastical dream, or maybe a nightmare, depending on how you feel about being chased by something that's part human, part stallion, and all chaos. The centaur, with its upper body of a rugged human and the lower body of a powerful horse, was one of the most iconic and troublesome creatures in medieval folklore. It's a blend of grace and wildness, intelligence and brawn, freedom and chaos, basically. The full package of trouble. To understand why centaurs held such an important place in medieval culture, we need to dig a little deeper into how they were viewed. Unlike dragons or griffins, centaurs weren't just symbolic representations of natural forces like fire or power. Instead, they represented the untamed, primal side of nature, those aspects of life that people could neither control nor tame. In fact, in the eyes of the medieval mind, the centaur wasn't a mystical creature with divine qualities, but a representation of the wild chaos that could overrun a world that tried too hard to control everything. The first thing you might notice about centaurs in medieval stories is that they were rarely the heroes. They were the chaos, the disarray, the very embodiment of what could happen when the boundaries between man and beast blur too much. They were unruly, wild, and known for their love of mischief, alcohol, and brawling. Imagine the centaur as that rowdy cousin who shows up at a family gathering, drinks too much, and then starts an argument with someone over something completely pointless. Only this cousin is 10 feet tall, with the strength of a horse, and no patience for anyone who tries to stop him from having his fun. The centaur's connection to chaos is particularly evident in Greek mythology. In those ancient stories, centaurs were often depicted as wild, untamed creatures that roamed the forests, living in packs and causing trouble wherever they went. They were unruly drunks, constantly clashing with other characters, and their behaviour was often far from noble. One of the most famous centaurs, Pholus, was known for his love of wine, so much so that he unintentionally started a battle when a bottle of wine was opened. Imagine what would have happened if he had a social media account. It would have been non-stop posts about his wild adventures and how centaurs gone wild moments. Even in their most heroic forms, centaurs were often portrayed as complicated, morally ambiguous creatures. They were intelligent, able to speak and hold philosophical conversations, but their wisdom was often clouded by their inability to control their more primal urges. In fact, centaurs are often depicted as being out of control, like a person with so much raw energy that they can't quite handle it. They had a deep connection to nature and were seen as the guardians of the wild, but their unpredictable nature made them dangerous, both to the people around them and to themselves. One of the most famous depictions of centaurs in medieval tales comes from the story of Chiron. Unlike many other centaurs who were chaotic and unruly, Chiron was revered for his wisdom and kindness. He was a healer, a teacher, and even trained many great heroes, including Hercules. He was the exception to the rule, showing that not all centaurs were troublemakers. But the fact that Chiron is the exception rather than the rule speaks volumes about how medieval society viewed the centaur. It wasn't so much that they couldn't be good or wise, it was that, as creatures of nature, they were prone to unpredictable behaviour. If Chiron were the standard, then it would have been a very different view of centaurs. Instead, they were wild, impulsive beings who had no fear of pushing the limits. Centaurs were also often depicted as skilled warriors, warriors of the wild who knew how to use their physical strength and speed to their advantage. In medieval tales, they were often seen as the masters of archery, galloping across the battlefield with ease and precision. The image of a centaur armed with a bow, racing through the forest, or charging into battle, was a popular motif in medieval art and stories. This image of the centaur as both a warrior and a symbol of natural chaos made them seem like creatures who could bring both destruction and protection, depending on who was in control. In many ways, the centaur was, like nature itself, something beautiful and awe-inspiring, but also completely unpredictable. But there was another layer to the centaur's character that fascinated the medieval world, their connection to humanity. Yes, they were half beast, but they also had human intelligence and emotions. They were torn between two worlds, the human and the animal, and that inner conflict made them particularly compelling figures in medieval stories. The centaur's struggle was often framed as a battle between civilization and the wild, between reason and instinct. These creatures weren't just animals, and they weren't fully human either. They were a reminder of the chaos that lurked beneath the surface of human civilization, the raw, untamed force that could break free at any moment. Of course, this tension between man and beast is central to the idea of the centaur. They were an allegory for the dangers of overindulgence in natural urges, for the perils of letting the wild side of life take over. Think about it, the centaur was the embodiment of what could happen if humanity gave in to its most primal instincts, uncontrolled, wild and destructive. The centaur was a warning, a reminder that we have to keep our wildness in check, lest we become just like them. But the centaur wasn't all bad. There was a part of them that symbolised a deeper connection to the earth, to the primal forces of nature that humans were only just beginning to understand. In a world where everything was so deeply tied to the natural world, the centaur's bond with the earth made them more than just a beast or a mythical monster. They were a creature that symbolised the ancient, untamed power of the land, a force that, while chaotic, was ultimately part of the same world humans inhabited. So, what's the takeaway here? The centaur might be half man, half horse, but it's their wild, untamed nature that made them both fascinating and dangerous. These creatures weren't just beasts to be tamed, but reminders of the primal forces that lurked in the shadows of medieval society, forces that could be either a gift or a curse, depending on how you dealt with them. Now that we've wandered through the chaos of centaurs, let's move on to another sea creature, one that might not have the same hooves or temper, but is just as dangerous in its own way. We're talking about the sawfish. This isn't just any fish. This is a creature that turned the sea into a weapon, with a nose sharp enough to tear through anything in its path. Next, we'll dive into the depths of the ocean and explore this very strange, very real sea beast. Alright, so picture this. You're out on the calm, open waters. The sun's just starting to dip below the horizon, casting a golden hue across the sea. You feel the gentle rocking of your boat, the breeze on your face, and the occasional splash of water as you move through the waves. Life is good. Then, suddenly, something catches your eye, a shadow darting just beneath the surface. Something that seems just a little too large, a little too fast for comfort, before you can even process it. There's a jolt, and you feel the boat lurch as if the sea itself is alive with a hunger you didn't know existed. And there, breaking through the water's surface, is something you can barely believe a fish, but not just any fish, a fish with a nose like a saw blade, cutting through the water with terrifying precision. Yes, you've just encountered a sawfish, and no, this isn't a scene from some over-the-top horror movie. This is real, or at least it was to those who sailed the medieval seas. The sawfish, with its long flat snout resembling nothing more than the teeth of a giant saw, was both a terrifying and mesmerising creature to those living in the Middle Ages. It wasn't like anything they'd ever encountered before, a creature of the deep, with a nose that could chop through almost anything in its path. The sawfish was more than just a fish, it was a weapon of nature, a testament to the unpredictable power of the sea, and a reminder that nature doesn't play fair when it comes to survival. In medieval times, people didn't have the luxury of modern science or marine biology to explain what they saw when they came across a sawfish. These creatures were just another part of the wild mysteries of the oceans, and they filled the imaginations of sailors and adventurers alike. The sawfish was no mere curiosity, it was a real threat, a creature whose very existence seemed to defy logic, if you were a sailor. Encountering a sawfish wasn't just an exciting tale to tell over a mug of ale, it was an omen, and not necessarily a good one. Now, let's dive a bit deeper into what made the sawfish so terrifying. For one thing, their long serrated snouts were incredibly effective at cutting through their prey. This wasn't just some ornamental feature, this was the sawfish's primary weapon. Imagine a fish with a tool built specifically to hack and slash through water with the precision of a blade. Medieval sailors who encountered sawfish, or heard tales of them, could only imagine the power they wielded. Whether the sawfish was used for hunting smaller fish or defending itself from larger predators, its saw blade was no joke. It wasn't just a defensive feature either. It could slice through nets, pierce wooden hulls, and tear into anything unfortunate enough to get too close. The medieval world had no real way of understanding how such a beast could exist, so they resorted to folklore, superstitions, and myths to try to explain it. But why were the sawfish such an object of fascination? It's all about the weaponry. The long snout was so bizarre that it captivated the imagination of those who heard about it. A fish with a blade for a nose. It was like something out of a nightmare, a creature crafted by the gods, or maybe by nature itself, to make sailors' lives just that much more difficult. Medieval bestiaries, which catalogued all sorts of weird and wonderful creatures, often had illustrations of sawfish, sometimes depicted with exaggerated features. This monstrous fish was thought to be a tool of destruction, a guardian of the sea's hidden depths, and a symbol of the dangers that lurked beneath the waves. Of course, sailors being sailors. There were a variety of stories and superstitions surrounding the sawfish. Some believed that the sawfish's blade could cut through anything, including the very fabric of the world itself. Others thought that the sawfish's nose had magical properties, capable of warding off evil or bringing bad luck to ships that ventured too far from the shore. The truth, of course, was much less mystical. The sawfish simply used its saw-like snout to hunt and defend itself. But in the medieval world, a creature like that might as well have been a creature of myth, an embodiment of the sea's most primal, untamable forces. And while we're talking about this fish's terrifying weaponry, let's not forget the role it played in medieval art. Artists of the time were fascinated by these strange, monstrous creatures, and sawfish were often depicted in illustrations with just a bit of embellishment. They became part of a tradition of depicting sea monsters, those creatures that seem to embody the unknown and the terrifying depths of the ocean. But as much as these creatures were depicted as ferocious, the sawfish wasn't a purely malevolent figure. It was simply part of the natural world, a fish like any other, driven by the instinct to survive. Its terrifying appearance and formidable weapons were just the tools it used to get by in the vast and unpredictable sea. Medieval tales often blurred the line between reality and myth, which is why the sawfish became such a powerful symbol in the minds of sailors. They were part of the pantheon of sea monsters that seemed to rise up from the depths to challenge humankind's understanding of the world. And when a ship hit a particularly rough patch of water, or when a sailor saw something in the waves that made him question his reality, it wasn't hard to imagine that a sawfish was lurking beneath the surface, just waiting to cut through the hull and drag the unlucky ship into the abyss. This isn't so much a stretch when you consider how little medieval sailors knew about the ocean. With vast unknowns like this, every mysterious splash and every strange creature was a source of fear and fascination. The sawfish's long serrated snout wasn't just for hunting, either. It was also used to stir up the water and disorient prey by thrashing its saw back and forth. The sawfish could create a cloud of debris that hid its movements, giving it the element of surprise. Now, imagine this in the context of medieval mythology. The sawfish was not just a scary creature, it was a tactical genius. The sea was its domain, and it moved through it with the quiet, patient precision of a hunter waiting for its moment. Sailors, who relied on their knowledge of the tides and the wind, were unprepared for a predator that could use its very body as a tool to disorient and strike with deadly accuracy. But the real fear, of course, came from the fact that the sawfish was so unpredictable. You never knew when one would show up or what it might do. Its appearance alone was enough to stir up some serious anxiety. The vastness of the sea was already intimidating, but knowing that creatures like the sawfish existed within its depths made the waters even more dangerous. With its powerful, sharp nose, the sawfish could break through the most secure defences, and for the people of medieval Europe, this made the sea feel like an endless, unpredictable source of fear. In a world already steeped in superstition, the sawfish became a symbol of the unknown, its very existence challenging the boundaries of what was considered possible. As much as the medieval world feared and revered sea monsters like the sawfish, it was the unknown that truly terrified them. The sea, with all its mysteries, could give birth to creatures so strange and dangerous that even the most seasoned sailors couldn't fathom what lay beneath the waves. The sawfish was just one of many monsters that roamed the waters of medieval mythology. While it may not have had the fire-breathing powers of a dragon or the terrifying hunger of a kraken, it was still a creature to be reckoned with, a reminder that, no matter how far you sailed, the sea always held something darker, something more dangerous just beneath the surface. Now that we've explored the depths of the sea and encountered the terrifying sawfish, let's move on to another oceanic beast, the mermaid. These creatures might seem beautiful, even alluring, but beware, as we'll soon see. There's far more to them than meets the eye. Imagine this, you're sailing across the open sea, the horizon stretching out endlessly before you. The sea is calm, almost too calm, and the air is thick with that salty tang as the waves lazily lap against the sides of your ship. You lean over the edge to catch a closer look at the water below. The sun reflects off the surface, casting fleeting, golden streaks that make the ocean look like something out of a dream. Suddenly, you hear a sound, a haunting melody, a song so sweet it almost makes your heart skip a beat. You peer out across the water, and that's when you see it, a figure rising from the waves. A beautiful woman with long flowing hair, a shimmering tail, and eyes that seem to draw you in like a magnet. It's a mermaid, a creature of legend, and for a moment, you're entranced by her song. But wait before you can even take a breath. The water around you begins to churn, the waves grow larger, the ship rocks violently, and that sweet melody turns into a cacophony of shrill, hypnotic notes. You've just made one of the biggest mistakes of your life. Mermaids, in medieval lore, were not just enchanting and alluring, they were dangerous. These creatures were as beautiful as they were deadly, and sailors who encountered them were often lured into the depths by their seductive songs. But let's not get too carried away by their romanticised image. The truth is, mermaids were not just mystical sirens of the sea. They were terrifying, cunning predators who used their beauty and charm to manipulate those who crossed their path. In the medieval period, sailors often found themselves the subject of legends about mermaids. According to some accounts, these half-woman, half-fish creatures would sing haunting melodies that could lure even the most experienced sailors into a trance. The songs were so mesmerising that they could make even the hardiest of men lose their bearings, steering their ships directly into dangerous waters. If the sailors weren't careful, they'd find themselves shipwrecked, stranded in the ocean, or worse, drowned in the depths of the sea. So, why were mermaids seen as both seductive and perilous? Well, let's start with their appearance. Mermaids, as described in medieval texts, were often depicted as beautiful women with long flowing hair and smooth, pale skin, traits that made them seem like figures of unattainable beauty. Their fishtails, shimmering in the water, only added to their allure. Their beauty was enchanting. Yes, but their true nature was far from sweet. While the mermaid's appearance and song were designed to draw sailors in, their true goal was often much more sinister. In many stories, they used their charm to lead sailors to their doom, causing them to crash their ships or lose their lives in the waves. The mermaid's beauty was a double-edged sword. It enticed, but it also destroyed. The idea of the siren, similar to a mermaid, but with even darker connotations, was a mainstay of medieval mythology, while mermaids were sometimes depicted as beautiful and tragic. Sirens were almost universally feared as creatures that could bring death and destruction with nothing more than their voices. The siren's song was said to have the power to hypnotise, pulling sailors to their deaths by drowning or shipwreck, whereas mermaids were sometimes seen as playful or romanticised. Sirens were almost always viewed as malevolent forces of nature. The lines between the two creatures often blurred, especially in early medieval depictions. But the key difference was in the intent. Mermaids, though dangerous, were sometimes seen as tragically misunderstood creatures that simply wanted to be seen, while sirens were actively seeking out sailors to feed their dark appetites. But how did these stories of mermaids originate? Well, like many medieval myths, the mermaid legend likely arose from a combination of factors. The idea of a half-human, half-animal creature was nothing new. Many cultures across the world have stories of such hybrids, dating back to ancient times. The most likely explanation for the mermaid myth, however, lies in the misidentification of real sea creatures. One popular theory is that mermaid sightings could have been the result of sailors encountering manatees or dugongs, large aquatic mammals with smooth bodies and elongated tails. When seen from a distance, these creatures, particularly the females, might have appeared to have the upper body of a woman with the right conditions: low light, fatigue, or poor eyesight. It's easy to see how such creatures could be mistaken for mermaids. Additionally, the isolation of sailors at sea, combined with the harsh conditions of medieval life, often led to the spread of exaggerated and fantastical tales. The human mind, craving stories to explain the unknown and cope with the dangers of the ocean, began to weave mermaid legends that mixed beauty with peril. The mermaid became a symbol of both the dangers of the sea and the temptation of the unknown, a duality that was central to the medieval worldview. Now, let's talk about how mermaids were depicted in medieval bestiaries, the encyclopedic books of fantastical creatures. In these texts, mermaids were often shown with the head, arms, and torso of a woman and the tail of a fish. But there were variations in the details sometimes. They had fish-like scales on their bodies, while other times they were depicted with human-like features, further blurring the line between woman and sea creature. These depictions often painted mermaids as enigmatic beings, not quite human, but not entirely beast either, trapped between two worlds. In one famous example, the Aberdeen Bestiary, which dates back to the 12th century, the mermaid is portrayed as a creature of both charm and danger. Her beauty is emphasised, but so is her role in pulling sailors to their doom. The illuminated manuscripts that featured these creatures often showed them as symbols of temptation, using their beauty to distract sailors and lure them to their deaths. The bestiaries themselves were often both educational and cautionary, teaching people about the creatures that existed or perhaps didn't exist in the world around them, while also warning them of the dangers lurking in the unknown. But mermaids weren't just confined to ancient texts and sea-bound myths. In medieval Christianity, they took on a new symbolic meaning. They were often seen as representations of the dangers of temptation and sin, the allure of the mermaid. In this context, it could be compared to the allure of earthly pleasures that led one away from the righteous path. A mermaid's beauty could symbolise the seductions of the world, which might draw a person in, only to bring them into ruin. The dual nature of the mermaid, combining both beauty and danger, made them the perfect metaphor for the human struggle against temptation. As the medieval period gave way to the Renaissance, the image of the mermaid continued to evolve. While the earlier, more ominous interpretations still held sway, mermaids also became a symbol of untamed beauty and a romanticised ideal of the wild and mysterious forces of nature. They were no longer purely creatures of doom, but rather symbols of the allure and mystery of the sea. Renaissance artists, in particular, were fascinated by the idea of the mermaid as a subject for their work, and their depictions varied from the seductive to the tragic, reflecting changing attitudes toward these mythical creatures. Despite the evolving interpretations, the basic symbolism of the mermaid remained intact, a creature of both fascination and fear, a double-edged sword that could charm and destroy in equal measure. Whether they were seen as temptresses of the sea or tragic figures misunderstood by sailors, mermaids retained a grip on the imagination for centuries to come, and to this day, the idea of the mermaid continues to evoke a sense of wonder and danger, reminding us that even the most beautiful things can have a dark side. And while mermaids have earned their place in both mythology and art, they weren't the only sea-dwelling creatures with the power to captivate and terrorise. No, there were other monsters out there, creatures so legendary that even the bravest of sailors couldn't escape their mythical clutches. If you thought the mermaid was the worst the sea had to offer, well, you might want to hold on tight, because next, we're diving into the terror that is the Kraken. So, keep your eyes peeled, because this one might just pull you under. The Sirens song, it's the stuff of nightmares. Or at least, it should be, if you've ever heard about them. You've likely heard how their songs were the ultimate weapon songs, so sweet, so hypnotic, that they could lull even the most hardened sailor into a stupor. But this isn't some fairy tale, where the sailor eventually shakes off the trance and swims back to shore. No, Sirens had a one-way ticket in mind for their victims, and the final stop a watery grave. So, let's take a deep dive into the deadly world of the siren, the sea's most treacherous temptress. Imagine the scene: you're out on the open sea, far from any land, when the stillness of the water is suddenly broken by a sound, a haunting, beautiful melody. It's impossible to ignore. The notes of the song drift across the waves, floating on the breeze, and for a moment, everything else, the creaking of the ship, the slapping of the waves, seems to vanish. It's as though the music is pulling at your very soul. Your eyes dart around, searching for the source, and then, out of nowhere, you see it, a figure, just barely visible above the water. Her form rising slowly, impossibly graceful. She's singing, her voice carrying across the sea like a lover's whisper, her hair wild and her eyes locked onto yours. But before you can even process what you've just seen, something deep within you starts to change. There's an undeniable pull, something you can't explain, a desire, a need, that makes you forget everything around you. The mermaid, or rather, the siren beckons, and suddenly, your ship feels like a cage. You can't help it. You begin to steer towards her, drawn to her like a moth to a flame, unaware that what lies beneath the surface of the water is a deadly, watery abyss. That, my friend, is the power of the siren, a creature of the deep whose sole purpose is to lure sailors to their doom. Unlike the seductive mermaid, the siren is not merely a creature of beauty, she is a weapon. While both mythological creatures share the ability to enchant with their appearance and voice, the siren takes it a step further. She uses her song to manipulate, to control, to bring men to their deaths. Let's take a closer look at what made the siren so dangerously effective. First off, her voice. Descriptions of the siren's song vary from one legend to the next. But one thing remains constant: the song is irresistible. Some say it sounds like the sweetest melody you've ever heard. A voice so pure and so haunting that it feels like it's touching something deep inside your soul. Others describe it as a kind of hypnotic chant that freezes you in place, rendering you powerless against its pull. In every case, the song is the siren's weapon. It's not just an innocent tune, it's a lure, designed to confuse and mesmerize those who hear it. And once a sailor is caught in the song, it's only a matter of time before he's lost to the sea. But where did these sirens come from? How did they become such feared creatures of myth? Well, as with many ancient legends, there's no single origin story. The sirens' earliest roots trace back to Greek mythology, where they were typically depicted as bird-like creatures with the heads of women. These bird women would perch on rocky islands and sing their fatal melodies to passing ships, leading sailors to shipwrecks and ruin over time. However, the siren's form evolved in popular imagination by the medieval period. They were commonly portrayed as more human-like, with the upper bodies of women and the lower bodies of fish, a blend of both mermaid and bird. One thing that remains consistent across all depictions, however, is the siren's purpose: destruction. Unlike mermaids, who might sometimes be depicted as tragic, misunderstood creatures, sirens were almost always seen as malicious, actively seeking to lead sailors to their doom. And while mermaids could sometimes be seen as symbols of both temptation and purity, sirens were always a warning, a representation of the dangers of giving in to earthly pleasures or desires. Interestingly, despite their fearsome reputation, sirens weren't just random creatures of the sea. In many stories, they were tied to the larger narrative of human struggle and temptation. For instance, in Homer's Odyssey, the hero Odysseus encounters sirens while trying to make his way home, forewarned by the sorceress Circe. Odysseus has his men block their ears with wax so they can't hear the siren's deadly song. But even Odysseus, bound to the mast of his ship, can't resist the urge to hear their voice. The temptation is too much for him, but he remains tied up, literally and figuratively, by the dangers of his own desires. This moment exemplifies the danger of the siren's song, not just a physical threat, but a metaphorical one, representing the human struggle against temptation and the peril of surrendering to it. In the medieval period, the concept of the siren expanded further into religious and philosophical realms. Sirens were often depicted as embodiments of sin, temptation, and moral decay as Christianity spread across Europe. Many of the ancient myths were reinterpreted in Christian terms, with sirens now seen as symbols of the allure of sin and the dangers of straying from the righteous path. Much like the serpent in the Garden of Eden, the siren became a symbol of temptation that led people away from God, drowning them in the sins of the world. Sirens' ability to sing and lure men to their deaths was likened to the temptations of worldly pleasures, which could ultimately lead to spiritual ruin. But beyond their metaphorical significance, sirens were also a part of the rich tapestry of medieval bestiaries, the same illuminated books filled with depictions of strange and wonderful creatures that included mermaids, dragons, and unicorns. In these texts, sirens were often portrayed as beautiful women with long flowing hair, their eyes dark and hypnotic, their bodies sleek and smooth like those of mermaids. They were often shown seated on rocks or hidden behind waves, their songs drawing sailors into the dangerous waters. These illustrations not only fueled the fear and fascination with these creatures, but also served as a reminder to medieval audiences of the ever-present danger of temptation and the unknown. Historians still argue over the exact origins of the siren myth, but most agree that it likely stems from the belief in supernatural beings that controlled the elements, particularly the sea. The sirens, with their power over the waves, may have been seen as agents of chaos, capable of tipping the balance between nature and civilization. Whether born from sailors' tales of real creatures like the seabirds or mermaids, or from ancient traditions of water spirits, the siren's role as a malevolent force was firmly established by the time of the medieval period. As the siren myth spread through Europe, it took on new forms, but the basic themes remained the same. Sirens were creatures of temptation, their songs sweet but deadly, their beauty both a blessing and a curse, their portrayal in art, literature, and later popular culture was often designed to remind people of the dangers lurking beneath the surface, both in the sea and in the world around them. And let's not forget the modern interpretations of the siren. While the myth has been romanticised in recent years, particularly in books, movies, and even video games, the underlying threat still remains. The siren, as a symbol of seductive danger, continues to captivate audiences, reminding us that even in our most peaceful and serene moments, there may be dark forces lurking just beneath the surface, whether in myth or in modern storytelling. The siren's call is one that many are still drawn to, even if they know better than to answer. So, the next time you find yourself near the sea, whether on a boat or just standing at the edge of the shore, remember the siren song. It might be a sweet melody, but beneath its beauty lies a deadly truth. And who knows, maybe you'll hear the call yourself. Just be careful not to answer. The sea is vast, mysterious, and deep, so deep that even today, we've only glimpsed a fraction of its secrets. But imagine sailing through that expanse back in medieval times, when the only light on the horizon came from the moon and the waves crashed in endless rhythm, making every night feel like an adventure or a nightmare. For those voyaging into the unknown, there was one creature that loomed larger than the rest, the kraken. This wasn't just any sea creature. No, it was a terrifying monster of the deep, a legend that sent shivers down the spines of sailors for centuries. Its description varied, of course, but the kraken was usually depicted as a colossal, squid-like creature, its massive tentacles rising from the sea like the hands of a vengeful god, ready to drag ships and sailors into the depths of the abyss. It wasn't just its size that made it so fearsome, though. It was the uncertainty of its existence. Some sailors swore they had seen its enormous tentacles reach up from the depths, while others believed it was simply a myth, a tale spun to explain the mysterious disappearances of ships and men. And honestly, who could blame them for thinking that way? After all, in an age where the horizon seemed like an endless line between the known world and the great unknown, anything could be possible. Now, let's talk about how these legends got their start. The kraken's origins are murky, like the very waters it was said to inhabit. Some historians believe it was inspired by real creatures, such as giant squids, which can grow to lengths of up to 40 feet or 12 metres, but even that is small fry compared to the kraken's size, which, according to some medieval texts, was described as being large enough to rise from the ocean floor and tower over ships, its tentacles long enough to encircle entire vessels. Imagine that for a second. You're standing on the deck of a ship, feeling the wind in your hair, the spray of salt water on your face, when suddenly, wham, the ocean beneath you seems to come alive. A massive tentacle, as thick as a tree trunk, crashes down on your ship, tearing it apart like a toy. Men scream in panic, falling into the water, and the ship begins to tilt before disappearing beneath the waves. That's the kraken in action. But the kraken wasn't just a random terror. Oh no, it was a creature of great strategic skill. Its tentacles were said to reach out with deadly precision, pulling down the largest ships and dragging their crew into the dark, uncharted waters below. These tentacles, each the size of a ship, were capable of snapping masts like twigs and crushing hulls like brittle wood. But this wasn't a mindless monster, it was a hunter. It would wait in the depths, its massive form hidden beneath the waves, waiting for the right moment to strike. It was as if it knew when to attack and when to stay hidden, making it even more terrifying. Let's take a moment to think about this. Medieval sailors didn't have the technology or the tools to understand the world beneath them. Their maps often had parts labelled simply as "Here be dragons" or "Terra incognita," meaning areas that were so mysterious that they were practically off limits to the imagination. The kraken thrived in that uncertainty. It was a monster created by fear and the unknown, a symbol of the vastness of the ocean and the smallness of humanity in comparison. But the kraken didn't just make sailors afraid of the ocean, it also made the ocean a thing of legend. It embodied the deep, dark waters that were beyond human comprehension. The ocean was no longer just a place where fish swam, it became a realm of monsters and myth. The kraken was its king, reigning supreme over the deep sea, a ruler who could devour entire ships with nothing but its terrifying, unrelenting grasp. The legends surrounding the kraken spread throughout Europe, and sailors from different parts of the world swapped tales of their encounters. One famous account, written in the 18th century, tells the story of a ship sailing off the coast of Norway, when a kraken appeared and swamped the ship, dragging it down with its mighty tentacles. That story, along with others, spread like wildfire and helped establish the kraken as one of the most feared and revered creatures in the mythology of the sea. Interestingly enough, despite the many reports of kraken sightings, some historians still argue whether the creature was merely an exaggerated myth, a tale spun by sailors to explain mysterious disappearances, or if there was something more to the story. Could the kraken have been based on sightings of giant squids or octopuses, some of which can grow to enormous sizes? And if so, did the sailors of the time misinterpret these encounters as being something far more fantastical than they really were? It's a debate that still rages on, with some saying the kraken is as real as any other sea creature, while others claim it's nothing but an overactive imagination. In any case, the kraken continues to haunt the sea in the minds of many. Over the centuries, it has become a symbol of the unknown, a representation of the raw power and danger that lurks just beneath the surface of the ocean. And even today, the kraken lives on in popular culture, making appearances in everything from movies to books, ensuring that its terrifying legacy is never forgotten. It's hard to look at the ocean the same way after learning about the kraken when you stand at the edge of the water, watching the waves crash against the shore. You might find yourself wondering, is it out there? Are those tentacles waiting, hidden beneath the surface, ready to strike when you least expect it? But before we go spiralling down that path of terror, let's bring it back to the humans, those brave sailors who sailed off into the wild blue yonder, believing that they were explorers, carving new paths in the world. They didn't have the luxury of knowing how big the ocean truly was. All they had were their wits, their ships, and their belief in something greater than themselves. For many, the kraken was a reminder that no matter how much they thought they knew about the world, there were still mysteries out there, monsters lurking in the shadows, waiting for their moment to strike. So, as you lay down tonight, thinking of the deep, dark seas, remember this. There are still creatures out there, real or imagined, that continue to captivate our imaginations, to keep us guessing, to remind us that there's always more to discover, even in the places we think we understand the best. The kraken, like many of the other creatures in our journey tonight, will continue to haunt us with its mythos, its mystery, and the promise of the unknown as we drift through the night, enveloped by the warmth of our blankets and the soft whispers of our imagination. Let's reflect on the creatures we've encountered on this journey. The kraken, the mermaids, the dragons, and all the other beasts that once roamed the minds of medieval thinkers. They were never just simple stories. They were reflections of the human experience, capturing our awe, our fears, and our unending quest for understanding. In medieval times, the world was a vast and terrifying place. What we now know as science and geography was, at the time, largely a mystery. The edges of the map were uncharted, and beyond those borders, no one knew what awaited. The oceans were filled with creatures like the kraken, which, while terrifying, symbolised the unknown that awaited beyond the horizon. The forests were home to beings like manticores and griffins, whose hybrid forms blurred the lines between nature and myth. The very idea of these creatures helped explain the mysteries of the world, even if the explanations were as fantastical as the creatures themselves. But these creatures didn't just serve as explanations for the unknown, they also served as metaphors for the struggles and dangers of life. The kraken, for instance, represented the terrifying power of the sea, an uncontrollable force that could easily swallow up the bravest sailors. The mermaids and sirens were both alluring and deadly, symbolising the dangers of temptation and the consequences of surrendering to our desires. The dragons, ever present in medieval stories, were not only dangerous beasts, but also representations of the inner battles we face with our own fears and ambitions. The medieval mind was captivated by the supernatural and the monstrous. They saw the world through a lens coloured by both wonder and fear. Every new discovery, whether a new species of animal or a strange phenomenon, was either celebrated as divine or dreaded as an omen. A strange fish washed ashore. It could be a new monster from the depths, a thunderstorm that struck with unusual force. It could be the wrath of an ancient god or a dragon. These creatures were the answers to questions that could not yet be answered by reason alone. The world was still full of magic, mystery, and unexplained wonders, and people were willing to believe in the monsters that walked the earth, swam the seas, and soared through the skies. Historians still argue whether these beliefs were simply a product of human imagination, or whether there was some kernel of truth to the stories of giant beasts and impossible creatures. Were there really animals that inspired the legends of mermaids, dragons, or krakens, or were these creatures entirely the products of people's minds trying to make sense of a world they didn't fully understand? Perhaps it was a bit of both. Some believe the origins of such creatures lie in misidentified animals, like the narwhal, whose single long tusk might have inspired tales of unicorns, or the giant squid, whose massive tentacles could easily be mistaken for the appendages of the mythical kraken. The real question, however, is not whether these creatures existed, but how their stories came to shape human culture and imagination. The tales of these medieval monsters have endured through the centuries, evolving and mutating as they passed from one generation to the next. Every era has added its own spin to these ancient stories. The mermaid, once a symbol of temptation and danger, has transformed in modern times into a symbol of freedom, beauty, and mystery, especially in popular culture. The sirens song, once a death sentence, has been reimagined as a call to adventure or even romantic longing. The dragon, once a fearsome beast of legend, is now often portrayed as a wise creature or a symbol of inner strength and transformation. This ability to adapt and evolve has allowed these monsters to maintain their grip on our collective imagination. But perhaps that is the most lasting legacy of these creatures. While the maps of the medieval world may have changed, the stories of monsters have not. They have evolved, yes, but they are still with us today, in books, movies, and legends. We still find ourselves entranced by these stories, by the mysterious and the unknown, by the creatures that lie just beyond our understanding. We live in an age of knowledge and discovery, but the echoes of medieval monsters continue to resonate with us. In fact, one could argue that the fascination with these creatures has only deepened with time. We continue to search for answers in the vast unknown. Just as the sailors of the past once did, we venture into the deep oceans, exploring the very places where the kraken might have lived. Even though we now know that no tentacled beast lies beneath the surface at least, not one that can drag ships into the depths. The stories of dragons and unicorns still captivate us, as they have for centuries. The fascination with mythical creatures is not just about fear, it's about the wonder of the unknown. The idea that there is always something more to discover, always something beyond what we can see or understand. These monsters remind us of our own limitations, and yet they also inspire us to keep looking, to keep imagining, to keep striving to understand the world around us. Think about the allure of the sea, the ocean, vast and uncharted, is still as mysterious today as it was for sailors in the medieval era. The idea that beneath those dark waves could lie an unknowable terror still stirs the imagination. And then there's the sky, the place where griffins and dragons once soared, where heroes and adventurers were said to battle monsters in the clouds. Even today, we look up at the stars and wonder what could be out there, what mysteries remain, waiting to be uncovered by the next brave explorer. In a way, the legends of medieval monsters still guide us, urging us to venture into the unknown, to explore the mysteries of the world that have yet to be explained. And perhaps that's the most magical thing of all, that even in the absence of the monsters themselves, their stories continue to shape our imaginations. The legend of the kraken, the myth of the mermaids, the fire-breathing dragon, all these creatures live on. Not because they were real, but because they still have something to teach us. They remind us that we are small in the grand scheme of things, that the world is much bigger and more mysterious than we can comprehend, and that there will always be something more to discover. The monsters of the medieval world were not just fantastical beasts, they were metaphors, embodiments of the things we fear, the things we long for, and the things we don't yet understand. They taught people to respect the unknown, to be cautious in the face of things they could not control, and to imagine beyond the boundaries of the visible world. In a time when the world was still full of mysteries, these creatures represented the unknown, a reminder that there is always something more, whether that be in the depths of the sea, the forests, or the sky. As the centuries have passed, the world has changed. The unknown has shrunk as science has illuminated many of the dark corners of the earth. Yet, we are still haunted by the echoes of those ancient monsters in our books, in our movies. In our dreams they persist, and perhaps, in some way, they always will. So, as you breathe deeply tonight, think of the ancient sea monsters, the great flying beasts, the creatures that lurked in shadowed forests and dark caves. Let them lull you to sleep with their legends, and know that, even though they may no longer walk the earth, their stories live on, and in that way, they continue to shape us, to remind us of the vastness of the world and the mysteries that lie just beyond our reach. As the darkness closes in around you, let the memory of these monsters fade into the quiet of the night. The kraken sleeps beneath the waves, the dragons rest in their caves, and the sirens sing their last song to the ocean winds. They are gone, but they will always be with us, forever etched in our imaginations, our culture, and the stories we continue to tell. Now, as the night embraces you in its calm, let the soothing silence wrap around you. Drift deeper into rest, knowing that the mysteries of the world will always be there, just beyond the horizon, waiting to be discovered. Sweet dreams.